Hey everybody, you are listening to The Poison Lab, a show about poisoning from people who manage poisoning. I'm your host, clinical toxicologist and emergency medicine pharmacist Ryan, and this is a special Letter to the Pod episode. In October of 2023, we released a special episode that reviewed the American Heart Association's 2023 Management of Poisoning Cardiac Arrest or Life-Threatening Toxicity Guidelines with the lead and corresponding author, Dr. Eric Lavonas. Now, anytime a guideline is released, there's likely to be a little bit of debate over the recommendations that are made within. Often, those who interpret the evidence differently than how the guideline authors did, or feel that there were critical omissions from the guideline, will write in a letter to the editor so everyone can read the potential limitations of the guideline. This is a letter to the editor episode, where we'll have a few responses that were sent in from listeners, Dr. Michael Mullins, Dr. Donna Seger, and Dr. Leon Gussow, who are medical toxicologists. They're going to raise a few points related to the guidelines recommendations surrounding certain treatments, like intravenous fat emulsion, as well as the actual wording in the guidelines, and how it could be interpreted by a clinician who is not familiar with the literature. After we hear from our letter writers, there'll be a chance for the lead author of the AHA guidelines and our previous guest from our episode back in October of 2023, Dr. Eric Lavonas, to respond to the points from our letter writers. I'd like to highlight that this is not an uncommon scenario after a guideline is released. In fact, myself and some co-authors just wrote a letter to the editor to the societies that published the Diagnosis of Brain Death or Death by Neurologic Criteria guidelines and their limitations related to performing that testing on toxicology patients. In other words, it's not difficult for two rational people to read the same study and come to two different conclusions. This is because most of our literature is very fragile, meaning even small, well-conducted randomized controlled trials could likely dispel a number of beliefs surrounding treatments or most appropriate interventions in poisoning that are based off of animal studies, biologic plausibility of a mechanism, or uncontrolled case series or case reports that by their nature can't really evaluate the treatment effect of an intervention because there's no comparator, and most of them don't control for confounding demographic variables like patient comorbid illness or characteristics of exposure that could have actually led to the severe or unsevere outcome as opposed to any treatment given. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm rambling. We have very bad literature, and thus very intelligent people evaluating the literature are often left with many questions regarding the actual conclusions of any given case report or study. And thus, two reasonable people within our field could read the same article and come to two very different conclusions. That's why discussion around these topics is very helpful to point out flaws in theories surrounding the conclusion of any given paper and help provide additional data to frame the context of the finding of any given paper. And I am thrilled that that discussion is going to happen right here for the benefit of all of our listeners who may be utilizing these guidelines in real time. Dr. Mike Mullins provided an audio letter for his and Dr. Seger's letter, and I will be reading Dr. Gussow's letter aloud for him, and then we'll finish with Dr. Lavonas reading his letter in response. So, get out your notepad, sharpen a pencil, and get ready to take some bullet points. You can decide where you lie on this issue after listening to the responses from all of our authors today. Without further ado, let's dive in.
Let's start this off with our letter to the pod from Dr. Mike Mullins.
Hi, Ryan. Thanks for the opportunity to share my thoughts on this AHA guidelines paper that recently came out in circulation. Eric Lavonas and colleagues have attempted to provide evidence-based guidelines for treating cardiac arrest or life-threatening toxicity secondary to poisonings. I'm personally familiar with most of the authors and hold them in high regard. I applaud the considerable effort to bring this broad and complex topic to fruition, and I agree with most of what they present. However, several sections mischaracterize sources and make conclusions that conflict with the cited references. The sections on beta blockers and calcium channel blockers draw conclusions about intravenous lipid emulsion that conflict with the cited references. The section on beta blockers incorrectly cites Methani et al. By saying, quote, a retrospective study did not find the benefit of ILE therapy. Methani et al. Clearly studied patients of interest to the guidelines with cardiac arrest, hypotension, or bradycardia with failure of other treatments. Their case series of 36 patients included 10 patients poisoned by beta blockers or calcium channel blockers with no further breakdown by ingested drug. 7 of these 10 patients survived after receiving ILE. Methani et al. Correctly said, quote, claims on efficacy or lack of efficacy of ILE as an antidote cannot be made, unquote. Uncertain efficacy is not the same thing as no benefit. Similarly, the section on calcium channel blockers incorrectly characterizes Smolensky et al. By saying, quote, a large retrospective study did not find a benefit from ILE therapy in CCB poisoning, unquote. This misleadingly suggests a comparative study of ILE versus other treatments for calcium channel blocker poisoning. Smolensky et al. Studied only poison center fatality reports with any textual mention of ILE before the National Poison Data System began systematically recording treatment with ILE. Because the outcome, death, was the first inclusion criterion, the study could not possibly compare outcomes. Only 40% of the patients in the cohort had a calcium channel blocker ranked as first or second substance in the overdose. Further, patients in the entire cohort received ILE during cardiac arrest or as, quote, last resort, unquote, after other treatments have failed. To say that lipid emulsion failed requires us to say that norepinephrine, vasopressin, calcium salts, and in some cases high-dose insulin also failed. Are we ready to discard all of these other treatments as useless? Or are we willing to admit that the patients with these particular poisonings possibly were beyond our ability to rescue, whether due to the magnitude of their ingestions or to delays in reaching our care? In the calcium channel blocker section, the authors have unusual wording. The guideline recommends against, quote, routine use of the ILE for calcium channel blocker poisoning, unquote. They specifically use the word routine. While I agree that other treatments, especially vasopressors, should occur first, it is difficult to regard any treatment of severe calcium channel blocker poisoning as routine. And no other treatment for any other poisoning in the guidelines paper is measured by this standard of routine use. Compare this to methylene blue. Methylene blue correctly received a 2B or weak recommendation signifying uncertain benefit. This recommendation rests solely upon a review of 17 cases, including 10 calcium channel blocker poisonings, 10 by amlodipine, 2 verapamil, and 2 diltiazem, with 4 deaths and 6 survivors among them. While the class of recommendation and level of evidence for methylene blue are appropriate, the human case evidence for and against ILE for calcium channel blocker poisoning is similar both in quality and quantity, and warrants a similar 2B recommendation signifying uncertainty about possible benefit. The calcium channel blockers section also cites a review by St. Ong et al. As indicating uncertainty over the role of ILE in calcium channel blockers poisoning that are refractory to other treatments. However, St. Ong et al. Gave a recommendation in their review corresponding to the class of recommendation of 2B, representing uncertain benefit, and supported ILE as one treatment option for calcium channel blocker poisonings that do not respond to first-line treatments. A 2014 case report by Cole et al. Is mischaracterized not once, but twice. First, the guidelines paper refers to the single case report when saying, quote, clinical data suggests that ILE increases intestinal absorption of medications, unquote. Now, there were no pre- or post-treatment concentrations measured, and the original authors themselves stated that increased absorption was unlikely due to the short interval between ILE treatment and the cardiac arrests, 30 seconds and 1 minute, respectively. Second, the guidelines paper implies that ILE directly caused asystole. Now, both patients had severe cardiogenic shock refractory to catecholamines, calcium, high-dose insulin, and glucagon. Both had a mean arterial pressure of 40 millimeters of mercury, and both had heart rates of 30 and 40 beats per minute, respectively, before receiving ILE. Both patients died of multisystem organ failure on hospital day 4 and 7, respectively, quite long after the ILE got used. Now, any cause and effect of ILE is completely indeterminate. Regarding sodium channel blockers, including tricyclic antidepressants or TCAs, I fully agree with the 2B recommendation regarding ILE if all of the treatments have failed. Sodium bicarbonate to overcome sodium channel blockade and to alkalinize the serum, and benzodiazepines for seizure control are clearly the first priorities in TCA poisoning. However, the authors overstate the conclusion from a non-clinical rat study by Parashon et al. By asserting that it shows that ILE increases drug absorption. Parashon et al. Found higher total amitriptyline concentrations in blood following ILE, but questioned whether sequestering amitriptyline in the blood rather than increasing absorption was the cause for this observation. Now, the limited reports of ILE in human TCA poisoning have conflicting results. The authors here rely upon an unpublished 2013 abstract with no peer review and no subsequent publication in the ensuing decade. This abstract, by Caznavier et al., which is very difficult to find, used the outcome of blood pressure after normalization of the electrocardiographic abnormalities. This was similar in the two groups, those receiving ILE and the control group or usual care patients. To restate this slightly, the outcome was blood pressure after the patient had improved. However, the patients receiving ILE reached electrocardiographic normalization about 20 minutes earlier than did the control patients. Now, without peer review or further review of the data, it is difficult to rely upon this abstract to support or refute benefit of ILE in TCA poisoning. So here, I agree with the guideline authors in assigning a 2B recommendation indicating uncertain benefit. The authors take the time to assert also that ILE has, at some time or another, clogged a veno-arterial extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, or VA-ECMO, circuit. But the 2014 source article by Levine et al. Clearly described continuous veno-venous hemodialysis, or CVVHD. This is a different circuit with a different caliber and quite different from VA-ECMO. Now, since 2012, the Toxicology Investigators Consortium, or TOXIC, has maintained a sub-registry of cases involving ILE. Another group led by Michael Levine recently published a review of 7.5 years of registry cases and found 134 patients who received ILE for various poisonings in this sub-registry. Among these patients, 108, or 81%, survived. 81% survived. These included 45 patients, or 34%, who had cardiac arrest. Calcium channel blockers, beta blockers, and bupropion were the leading intoxicants, comprising 37% of the cases, and 2/3 of these patients survived. This suggests possible benefit of ILE in selected patients with critical poisoning, but the lack of matched control patients limits any conclusions about efficacy. In summary, the correct class of recommendation for ILE in either beta blockers or calcium channel blockers is 2B, reflecting uncertain benefit for these two poisonings. Proper guideline development requires accurate and objective analysis of the source articles, and inaccurate conclusions made from the references may adversely influence future clinical treatments. Finally, I urge that clinicians and anyone in the sound of my voice treating a critically ill poison patient consult with a medical toxicologist or the Poison Control Center for the most current treatment guidance tailored to the patient's poisoning. Throughout the United States and its territories, America's Poison Centers provide free 24/7 access to the nearest Poison Control Center at 800-222-1222.
Thank you, Dr. Mullins, and I appreciate hearing your points there. Let's now dive into our next letter from Dr. Leon Gussow. He wrote in a letter to the editor, and since I don't have an audio file, I'm going to read it for Dr. Gussow. Dr. Feldman, I enjoyed your discussion with Dr. Eric Lavonas about the recently published 2023 American Heart Association focused update on the management of patients with cardiac arrest or life-threatening toxicity due to poisoning, for which he was the lead author. That set of guidelines were the result of a massive effort by a list of co-authors that includes some of the smartest people in medical toxicology. However, I was disappointed that your conversation did not touch on some important flaws that, in my opinion, impaired the general usefulness of the paper's recommendations. As Dr. Lavonas confirmed in the podcast, the guidelines were meant not for use by medical toxicologists, but by emergency practitioners and intensivists for reference when dealing with patients severely poisoned with agents like calcium channel blockers, beta blockers, digoxin, and the like. To be truly useful for that purpose, its recommendations have an obligation to be stated in clear, unambiguous language that gives actionable advice for specific situations. I feel the AHA guidelines frequently fall far short on that obligation. Let's say you are on the night shift at a busy local hospital, and a patient comes in after severely overdosing on a calcium channel blocker. After standard recommendations for treating hypotension with vasopressors and high-dose insulin, the authors recommend that it is reasonable to administer calcium. This is not so much a recommendation as a medical legal defense. Should calcium be administered or not? The clinician trying to manage this very sick patient is left to figure that out for him or herself. This recommendation is neither clear, unambiguous, or actionable. But it gets worse. The sixth recommendation states that it might be reasonable to attempt electrical pacing for calcium channel blocker poisoning with refractory bradycardia. Well, if it might be reasonable, it also might not be reasonable. There is no quick way to decide what to do based on this statement, and the clinician reading this would be left more confused than ever about whether or not to try pacing. This recommendation could have just as easily been replaced with a shrug emoji. The paper is rife with similar confusing recommendations. The authors of these guidelines might not be fully responsible for these ambiguous statements. My understanding is the AHA-style guidelines mandate the wording used. Unfortunately, the lack of clear, actionable advice in many of the recommendations vitiates the potential usefulness of the entire project.
Thank you, Dr. Gussow.
Yes, thank you for addressing those points in the guidelines. And with these insightful criticisms of the large effort of the American Heart Association's guidelines they put out, I'd like to give Dr. Eric Lavonas a chance to respond to our commentators.
So, hi, Ryan. First of all, let me say thank you to Mike Mullins, Donna Seger, and Leanne Gussow. It's clear that they engaged closely with our manuscript. Post-publication peer review is a really important part of the scientific process. And this manuscript was written with 14 authors and scrutinized by 8 really excellent peer reviewers prior to publication. But just like a drug trial, you learn more about a manuscript when it's sent out into the real world. So these highly respected toxicologists bring a perspective to the conversation that's really, really valuable. And I am grateful for their feedback. Now, there are about 900 medical toxicologists out there and thousands of other physicians who treat patients with critical poisoning. I'd love to hear from more of them. Mike Mullins and Donna Seger did a really detailed analysis of the references we used to support our recommendations about lipid emulsion therapy. Without going through their analysis point by point, let me say I agree with a lot of what they said. I quibble about some points. For example, I'm quite sure we did not misinterpret Maud St. Audge's calcium channel blocker guidelines, since Maud was one of our guideline authors. The Levine manuscript does, in fact, refer to lipid emulsion clocking a CVV HD filter, not an ECMO filter. But there's plenty of other literature showing that lipid emulsion can cause layering, aggregation, clotting, and filter obstruction in ECMO circuits. The case reports from the Minneapolis group discuss many possible explanations for why their patients had cardiac arrest very shortly after receiving lipid emulsion. The discussion section in that paper is outstanding, and the concerns about lipid absorbing or increasing absorption of medications from the gut are on point. Quite frankly, literature about lipid emulsion for poisoning in general, other than for bupivacaine and ropivacaine, is all over the map. And I still remain very concerned about what happens when there's a large reservoir of toxin in the gut and you give lipids. But all this gets directly to Dr. Gussow's point. The American Heart Association uses a strict and consistent process for guideline development and recommendation wording. It's fundamentally similar to GRADE. We formulate a PICO question and search the evidence. The guideline writers read all the papers together and evaluate the certainty of the evidence. AHA calls it strength of evidence, but I prefer the GRADE term certainty of evidence because it incorporates not just the design of and execution of the individual papers, but their relevance and consistency. Anyway, we consider that evidence in the context of other factors like practicality, cost, side effects, and alternative therapies. This is like the evidence to decision process and grade, and we try to be transparent about it. The result is a recommendation with a formal strength of recommendation statement. Now, language matters a lot in guidelines. Language that is too strong can put clinicians in a corner and also make it seem like there's more certainty about the right thing to do than there really is. Language that's too weak, as Leon points out, can seem wishy-washy. Now, AHA literally puts a box around this. It's table 1 in our manuscript and in every guideline statement the AHA has produced since 2015. While we can pick from a menu of recommendation wording based on the strength of recommendation, we can't go off the menu. Overall, I think this is a good thing since it signals to clinicians and researchers when we really know the right thing to do and we're making a best guess based on limited evidence. And that's absolutely the situation with the AHA lipid emulsion recommendations. For all 4 poisonings, we looked at a possible role for lipid emulsion therapy. That's beta blockers, calcium channel blockers, sodium channel blockers, and local anesthetics. We rated the certainty of evidence as class C based on limited data. The human data are mostly uncontrolled observations. The results are often inconsistent, and the animal studies are all over the map. In that situation, smart people can read the same literature and come to different conclusions. And that's great. As long as we're respectful when we argue about the science, we'll get better over time. Again, I can't overstate how grateful I am to Drs. Mullins, Seger, and Gussow for their feedback. I promise you their feedback is being used as we look at these recommendations for 2025. These are some excellent toxicologists. I respect them tremendously, and their observations make the science better. So on behalf of the writing group, thank you, Ryan, for allowing me the opportunity to respond.
What a fantastic discourse. Thank you to Drs. Mullins, Seger, Gussow, and Lavonas. I think we're all better armed to understand the limitations, context, and circumstance of how the guidelines came to be and how the data was interpreted. At the end of the day, it's up to you how you interpret and apply it. So I hope you found this useful. You can follow the show on social media if you want to hear about new episodes being released. We're on Twitter at LabPoison, myself at EMPoisonPharmD. We have a Facebook, The Poison Lab, and an Instagram, Talks_Talk. And yes, it is overwhelming trying to keep up with any of those things. So we might not always get back to you on messages, but please send them in. In fact, even better, send us an email at toxtalk1@gmail.com. If you have any questions or have an idea for a show that you'd like to hear, we love hearing from the community. As always, you can find all free medical games, resources, videos, and all 100% free episodes right on www.thepoisonlab.com. Should you feel you've enjoyed any of this discourse, clinical learning, or clinical debate, please leave us a review wherever you listen. It helps us reach other people interested in learning about toxicology. Okay, that'll wrap it up for this episode. Stay tuned. We have some really fun ones coming in the future. Thanks for listening today, and I hope I can catch you next time. Hey, Toxo, can you play us out?
The information on this show is for educational purposes only and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment recommendations. Contact your doctor for health questions or call your local poison center at 1-800-222-1222. The opinions expressed on this show do not represent those of our employers. This show is poorly written and shoddily produced by Ryan Feldman. Don't forget to give it a share with your nerdy friends. Cheerio, mates. See you next time.